You won't believe what I saw when I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work. I had just clocked out from a 14-hour shift and was looking forward to spending the weekend planning a quiet fishing trip with my daughter. But all of that screeched to a halt the moment I laid eyes on the bright orange paper fluttering on my family's 24-foot fishing boat. Our boat that had sat peacefully in the same spot on our land for 5 years without a single complaint. My heart started pounding as I stepped out of the car. I walked over, peeled the notice off, and scanned the words that would send my evening spiraling into chaos. Violation notice. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. At the bottom, in bold cursive, was a name I'd grown to dread. Margaret Winters, HOA President. Now let me get one thing straight. That boat? It's more than just fiberglass and paint. It's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather taught me to fish on it. My daughter learned to tie her first knot on its worn wooden deck. And as for its parking spot, dead center on a concrete slab on my private land, land clearly marked in county records and outlined by the original metal stakes that still gleam under the grass if you know where to look. So why, all of a sudden, was I getting slapped with a towing threat? That's when I heard it. The sharp, deliberate click-clack of designer heels on asphalt. Margaret, in her daily inspection power walk, was headed straight for my driveway, clipboard in hand and smug smile locked in place like it was drawn on with permanent marker. "Oh, good," she said with false cheer. "You got my notice. That boat simply has to go. It's lowering neighborhood property values. And per HOA regulations, recreational vehicles must not be visible from the street." I kept my jaw from dropping and took a breath. "Margaret, this is my land. The property line extends 15 feet beyond where you think it ends. I have the original survey and legal documents to prove it." Her smile didn't fade, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes. "Well, we recently had the property lines reassessed. That area is now considered common ground. The boat has to be gone by Friday." Common ground? Since when? I hadn't received any notice, and I served on the HOA Architectural Committee before she mysteriously disbanded it last month. Something about this didn't add up. And just like that, my quiet fishing weekend turned into something else entirely. A gut feeling told me this was only the beginning, and I had no idea just how deep Margaret's scheme would go. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that bright orange violation notice pinned to my boat like a scarlet letter. My stomach churned with unease, and something just didn't sit right with me. Margaret's smug declaration that my land was now common ground played over and over in my head like a broken record. I knew my property. I had walked every inch of it. I'd seen the old metal survey stakes myself when we first bought the house 5 years ago. But if I was right, if that land was still mine, then something far more sinister was going on. The next morning, coffee in hand and adrenaline still running high, I started digging. I pulled out my property documents from the filing cabinet. Maps, permits, the original survey from when the home was built. Everything clearly showed the same thing. My land extended 15 feet past the spot where my boat sat. That slab of concrete was on my property, no question. So where had Margaret gotten her updated plans? Just as I was reviewing the documents, my phone buzzed. A text from Derek, my neighbor 2 doors down. "Hey, check your cameras. I saw Margaret on your lawn with some guy in a suit last Tuesday. Looked like they were measuring something. Weird time to be doing surveys." It was 2 a.m. I rushed to pull up the security footage from last week, and sure enough, there she was, in the grainy night vision glow, standing at the edge of my driveway with a flashlight in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. Beside her, a man in a dark blazer scribbled notes onto a clipboard. But what made my skin crawl was what happened next. Thinking they were out of the camera's view, Margaret pulled something from her purse and handed it to the man. An envelope. Thick, padded, and discreetly passed like a back-alley deal. My hands clenched into fists. This wasn't about property values anymore. This was about power and control, and Margaret wasn't just overreaching. She was rewriting the rules in the dead of night. Later that day, I called Linda Chen across the street, retired property lawyer, sharp as a tack. When I told her what I'd seen and asked about the supposed reassessment, she laughed bitterly. "There haven't been any approved surveys filed with the county in over a decade," she said. "If someone's redrawing property lines, they're either misinformed or they're up to no good." As we spoke, something clicked. I remembered the architectural committee Margaret had suddenly disbanded last month, the same committee that used to review property issues like these. With no oversight in place, she was free to do whatever she wanted. And maybe I wasn't the only one. That evening, I walked the block, quietly, observantly, and I noticed something chilling. Metal property stakes, once aligned with fences or sidewalk edges, had been replaced in some yards, moved, repositioned, barely noticeable unless you were really looking. And then I saw the unthinkable. Margaret in front of old Mrs. Patterson's yard with a measuring wheel. She was writing something down, and her assistant was photographing the mailbox. A knot formed in my gut. This wasn't about one boat. This was a slow, calculated land grab. An HOA takeover by someone who thought no one would question her. But she underestimated how far I'd go to protect my home. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I had enough suspicion, and now enough evidence, to start pulling the thread. Whatever Margaret was doing, it was bigger than me. And if she was brave enough to forge property lines, what else was she willing to do? This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was war. The air in the community center was thick with tension as I stepped inside, a bulging folder tucked under my arm. I'd arrived early, hoping for a calm moment to collect my thoughts, but that was a fantasy. The room was already buzzing, neighbors whispering in tight circles, casting curious glances my way. At the head table sat Margaret Winters, our ever-so-powerful HOA President, dressed to impress in her designer blazer, flipping through a pristine leather notebook as if this were just another day in her queendom. She didn't even look up when I walked in. But I wasn't here to blend into the background. I was here to fight back. I took a seat in the front row, setting my evidence-laden folder beside me. The community center slowly filled up with residents, many of whom had recently received similar notices about revised property lines, sudden fines, or strange demands to move things they'd had in place for years. I could see confusion and unease on their faces. Margaret's storm was sweeping through more than just my yard. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Margaret cleared her throat and tapped her pen against the microphone. "Let's bring this meeting to order," she said, that syrupy voice of hers wrapping each word like a candy-coated blade. "We have some exciting updates about community improvements and—" I stood up. "Before we get to the exciting updates," I interrupted, my voice steady, "I'd like to discuss the sudden property reassessments and the legitimacy of the documents being used to enforce them." Margaret froze. Then she smiled, falsely as always. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to submit a formal request to be added to next month's agenda. I've already done that, 3 times. No response, I shot back, raising the folder. So I brought the documents anyway. A ripple of interest moved through the room. Margaret's eyes narrowed. I walked up to the front table and laid out my printed county records. Original property maps. Surveyor certifications, photos of boundary markers, all dated, notarized, and authentic. These maps clearly show that my boat is parked entirely on private land, my land, yet I received a towing notice claiming it's on HOA-owned common ground. Gasps echoed around the room. Margaret scoffed and stood up, yanking a stack of papers from her handbag. "These are the updated property assessments approved by the board. We've modernized the boundaries to reflect the evolving needs of the community." Linda Chen, my retired lawyer neighbor, raised her hand from the back. "Funny, Margaret. I checked with the county office. There haven't been any approved property reassessments filed in over 15 years. So where exactly did your updates come from?" That wiped the smug off Margaret's face. She stammered, We used a private firm for preliminary adjustments. Everything's pending official filing." "Then why are you enforcing them as if they're already law?" I asked, locking eyes with her. "Towing boats, threatening fines, sending out forged notices?" Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her papers. I stepped closer and pointed to the header on one of her documents. "This logo," I said, holding up one of her notices. "The font is wrong. The seal is off-center. And this notary stamp? It belongs to someone whose license expired 3 years ago." The room erupted into murmurs. Margaret looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. "I'm not the only one," I continued. "Derek from next door received a violation for his shed being too close to the new property line. So did Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Patel. But the new maps, all of them, conveniently expand the common area right up to the most valuable portions of private lots." Margaret's voice cracked as she tried to recover. "This is a misunderstanding. The board, which you dissolved and restructured by yourself," Linda interrupted. "No votes, no transparency." And then, from the back of the room, another voice joined in. Derek stood, face pale, hands shaking. "I helped Margaret draft some of those maps," he confessed. "She pressured me, threatened to report my unpermitted pool house. I didn't know it would go this far." Now the room turned hostile. Neighbors who once nodded politely to Margaret were whispering, some even stepping away from her table. A couple began filming on their phones. Margaret's mask finally cracked. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped. "You're all just upset because I'm enforcing standards." I stepped forward one last time. Enforcing fake standards, with forged documents and fake authority. The HOA meeting had turned into a courtroom, and Margaret had just walked herself into the witness box. But the verdict was still to come, and I wasn't done gathering evidence. Because something told me this went deeper than any of us imagined. It was the kind of morning that felt heavy with change. The air seemed thicker, more alert, as if even the breeze knew something big was about to break. After weeks of whispers, shady documents, and carefully gathered evidence, today was the day we ripped the curtain off Margaret's scheme. And the best part? She had no idea it was coming. The emergency HOA board meeting was called under the pretense of clarifying recent community confusion. Margaret, in her usual fashion, arrived early and confidently took her seat at the head of the table, her pearl necklace glinting beneath the overhead lights. She greeted everyone with her signature tight-lipped smile, but there was a flicker of something new in her eyes. Uncertainty. Maybe it was because neighbors had stopped responding to her greetings. Maybe it was because Linda Chen and I were setting up a projector in the corner of the room. As more residents packed into the community hall, I took a deep breath and stepped forward, carrying the evidence that would shake the very foundation Margaret had built her false authority on. "Before we begin," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I'd like to present some findings that concern every homeowner here, particularly regarding property lines, forged documents, and misuse of HOA power." Margaret shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around her notepad. "This isn't on the agenda," she said, her voice sharp. "No," Linda replied as she joined me at the front, "but fraud never is." I clicked the remote. The projector screen lit up with the first slide, a side-by-side comparison of official county property maps and the altered versions Margaret had been distributing. "These are the original plots filed at the county office," I explained. "And these," I pointed to the second set, "are the doctored versions Margaret submitted to the HOA and tried to enforce." Murmurs swept through the room. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Linda stepped in, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd spent decades practicing law. "We cross-referenced all the documents Margaret used to issue citations, fines, and towing threats. Not only are the changes unapproved by the county, but the notary stamps on at least 6 of them are invalid, one from a license that expired 3 years ago." Gasps echoed. "I'd like to show you something else," I said, flipping to the next slide, footage from my home security camera. It showed Margaret and Derek in the middle of the night, measuring land and exchanging an envelope. I paused the video on the moment Margaret handed him what clearly looked like a wad of cash. "This is how boundaries were redrawn," I said. "Not through legal process, through backdoor deals and coercion." Derek stood from the back of the room, pale and visibly shaken. "It's true," he said. Margaret blackmailed me. She knew about my unpermitted pool house and threatened to report it unless I helped her fabricate documents. I didn't know it would get this far. The room erupted into chaos. Neighbors shouting, some standing to demand explanations. Margaret tried to speak, but no one was listening anymore. Her empire, built on intimidation and falsified authority, was crumbling beneath her feet. Then, like a final nail in the coffin, Mrs. Rodriguez from the county clerk's office stepped forward. "There have been no approved property line changes filed in this neighborhood in over 20 years, she declared. Everything Margaret submitted is either incomplete, fraudulent, or entirely fictional. Margaret stood, her face flushed with panic, grasping for control. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was only doing what's best for the neighborhood." Linda stepped forward. "No, Margaret. You were doing what's best for you." And just like that, the tide turned. What had started as suspicion became confirmation. What had been whispers turned to roars. The residents of our neighborhood saw Margaret not as a leader, but as a liar. And justice, finally, was beginning to stir. The storm had been brewing for weeks. Accusations, fake documents, whispered threats, but now the lightning was about to strike. I didn't sleep the night before. My kitchen table had turned into a war room, papers and USB drives spread across every surface, security footage queued up on 3 different devices, each frame a puzzle piece in the unraveling of Margaret's empire. But what I held in my hands now wasn't just speculation or suspicion, it was proof. By 6 a.m., I was already at Linda Chen's house, sipping black coffee and finalizing our presentation. She'd printed the county records, the old neighborhood plans from 1995, and a stack of HOA violation notices that had curiously targeted only homeowners with larger yards or homes close to community access points. One thing had become clear. Margaret's game wasn't just about enforcing regulations, it was about carving up the neighborhood and selling it piece by piece. Then came the text that sealed everything. "I have something you need to see. Meet me at the cafe. Bring Linda." It was from Derek's wife, Amy. When we arrived, she handed us an unmarked manila envelope, her hands trembling. "He couldn't live with it anymore," she whispered. "He saved everything." Inside were dozens of printed emails, scanned copies of backdated property maps, and a USB drive. We opened it right there on Linda's laptop, our eyes widening with every file. One folder contained full scans of Margaret's forged documents, some even stamped with the notary seal of a person who hadn't practiced in years. Another held audio recordings of meetings in her backyard, where she casually discussed reclaiming community land with local developers. And the final video, that one left us breathless. It was a night vision clip from Derek's backyard camera. In the grainy green footage, Margaret could be seen directing 2 men in hoodies as they measured boundary lines in the dark. One man pulled out a can of spray paint and marked a new line on the grass, 10 feet into my property. The timestamp matched the week before she posted the towing notice on my boat. As if that weren't enough, the video clearly captured her handing over what looked like a padded envelope. "This is it," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is our turning point." We spent the rest of the day compiling everything into a bulletproof presentation. Each clip, each document, each email was placed in sequence, showing how Margaret systematically manipulated the HOA's power for personal gain. Derek, finally ready to step into the light, offered to testify. He gave us more files from Margaret's laptop, records of unauthorized land use deals, sketches of redrawn neighborhood plans, and notes about upcoming opportunities with phrases like claim corner lots and pressure with fines. The emergency HOA meeting that night felt different. People showed up early. They came in groups. Whispers filled the room, and eyes darted toward Margaret's chair. But when Linda and I wheeled in the projector and set up the speaker system, everything went silent. Margaret stood at the head of the room, feigning calm, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. I took a breath and started. "Before we begin tonight's meeting, I have a presentation regarding serious allegations of document falsification, land misappropriation, and HOA overreach." Margaret tried to interrupt. "This isn't proper procedure." "It is now," said Linda, stepping beside me. "The community deserves to know." We started the slideshow. First, the county property maps from 1995. Then, the doctored versions Margaret submitted. We laid out the inconsistencies. Property lines moved just enough to create common areas. Notary stamps from non-existent offices, altered file dates from weekends when the office was closed. And then we hit play on the audio recordings. Margaret's voice rang through the speakers. "If we shift the boundaries just a bit, we can use the bylaws to find them. They'll move or give up eventually." Gasps filled the room. Eyes widened. People leaned forward. But it was the video footage that broke the dam. The entire room watched as Margaret, under cover of darkness, orchestrated the false boundary markings on my land. Her voice, her movements, the envelope, it was all undeniable. The last piece? Derek stood up, his voice shaking but firm. "She blackmailed me. I helped her, but I kept everything. I couldn't do it anymore." The silence afterward was thunderous. Margaret stood frozen, her face pale, lips parted. Her carefully controlled image had shattered in one brutal, undeniable moment. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were witnesses. And this was the moment everything began to change. The community center was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Word had spread like wildfire. Tonight wasn't going to be just another HOA meeting about trash can schedules or fence heights. This was the night everything unraveled. The night Margaret Winters, our overreaching HOA president, would finally be forced to face the truth she'd spent months burying under a mountain of forged documents, manipulated maps, and silenced neighbors. I walked in with a flash drive in my pocket, a folder of hard evidence under my arm, and a storm brewing in my chest. Margaret sat at the head of the room like a queen on a crumbling throne. Her usual smirk was in place, but even from across the room, I could see the slight twitch in her eye, the way she kept straightening the papers in front of her over and over again. She'd heard the whispers. She knew the tide was turning. "Let's begin," she said crisply, tapping her gavel once with authority. "This evening's agenda includes enforcement measures for ongoing property violations." "Actually," I cut in, stepping forward, "I'd like to make a motion to address recent findings regarding HOA misconduct." I placed my folder on the podium and nodded to Linda Chen, who stood beside me in a sharp navy blazer, her posture radiating quiet confidence. The crowd quieted instantly. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "This is highly irregular." "Not nearly as irregular as filing falsified property maps with the county," Linda said smoothly, plugging in the flash drive. The projector lit up the wall with side-by-side scans, official property maps from 1995, next to Margaret's doctored versions. The room gasped. Home boundaries were shifted, driveways sliced in half, yards magically turned into common areas. "As you can see," I began, voice steady, "Margaret has been altering property lines to expand HOA control, and in some cases, those common areas she created were later leveraged to issue fines and demand fees." "Lies!" Margaret snapped, slamming her fist on the table. "You have no right to—" But I raised a hand and clicked to the next slide. An email from Derek to Margaret, discussing how to adjust maps without triggering too much attention. Gasps echoed through the room again, and then came the bombshell. Linda played the night vision footage from Derek's camera. The grainy video of Margaret and a mystery man spray painting new boundary lines in the dead of night. It was undeniable. Her face, her voice, the envelope passed under the cloak of darkness. The proof was there for all to see. Margaret stood up, her voice rising to a near scream. "You people don't understand. I was protecting the neighborhood. I've raised property values. You forged documents," Linda interrupted sharply. "You extorted residents. You used your position to line your own pockets." And then, like clockwork, Mrs. Rodriguez from the county clerk's office stepped forward. "There have been no legally filed property line changes in this neighborhood in over 20 years, she stated. "What Margaret submitted was flagged for fraud, and we've launched an investigation." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked around the room as if someone might still be on her side, but the board members sat frozen. Neighbors she had bullied stared with stunned expressions, and then Derek stood, his voice trembling. "I helped her. She threatened my family, but everything she did, it's all in this folder." He held up a thick binder and placed it beside mine. The final blow came when Linda pulled out a notarized statement from Margaret's own daughter, Emma, confirming her mother's long-term scheme. "She made me file papers," it read, even though she knew they were fake. Margaret didn't speak again. She sat down slowly, her hands shaking, her face ashen. The gavel that once echoed with power now sat unused before her. Someone from the crowd stood up and said what everyone was thinking. "I motion to remove Margaret Winters from the HOA board, effective immediately." A sea of hands shot into the air. The truth wasn't just revealed, it roared. And nothing in our neighborhood would ever be the same. The vote was unanimous. As Margaret Winters was officially removed from her position and escorted out of the community center by local authorities, a wave of silence washed over the room, followed by something even more powerful. Applause. Not the polite kind, but a roaring, thunderous standing ovation from neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak, too isolated to act. The fear that had hung over our street like a dark cloud finally began to lift. And in its place, something brighter emerged: hope, unity, and the long-lost feeling of community. The next morning felt like waking up in a different neighborhood. The tension that had gripped our cul-de-sac for months had disappeared. People who used to avoid eye contact now waved across fences. Conversations started happening again on porches, not in whispers behind curtains. Mrs. Rodriguez, who hadn't left her house since Margaret fined her for excessive flower pots, brought out her lemonade stand and sat smiling on her front steps. Derek, now free from the weight of guilt, helped repaint the community bulletin board with his daughter. And Linda Chen, our new HOA president, stood proudly beside it, pinning up the first agenda for our new transparent board meetings. It wasn't just about Margaret's removal. It was about reclaiming our homes, our dignity, and our connection with one another. That Friday, we held an impromptu block gathering. No permission forms, no HOA rules. Just tables filled with home-cooked meals, kids riding bikes without fear of fines, and laughter echoing down the street. Someone even brought out speakers and played classic tunes from the 70s. I saw neighbors dancing barefoot on their lawns, laughing like children. It was the first time I'd seen genuine joy on this block in years. The changes came quickly. All the fines Margaret had issued were frozen, then dismissed pending a full audit. With help from Linda and a few volunteers, including Derek and Mrs. Chen, we began the painstaking work of correcting the fraudulent property lines and filing the right maps with the county. Margaret's illegal accounts were frozen, and a portion of the funds she'd stolen were returned to the community fund. That money was used to fix the community pool, restock the little library, and start a neighborhood beautification project. But the real transformation wasn't in buildings or paperwork. It was in people. We started checking on elderly neighbors, hosting Sunday potlucks, and organizing volunteer crews for yard work. Emma, Margaret's daughter, now volunteers at our new HOA Ethics Committee. She said she wants to help build the kind of neighborhood she once watched her mother destroy. And we welcomed her with open arms, because this time, no one was going to be left out or left behind. In the end, Margaret's downfall wasn't just justice served. It was the spark that reignited our belief in community. We learned that silence allows abuse, but unity creates resilience. We found our voices, our neighbors, and our pride again, and this time, we're not letting go. Looking back on everything our community endured, one truth stands taller than any HOA policy or fraudulent boundary line. You are never too old, too small, or too tired to stand up for what's right. The ordeal with Margaret wasn't just a battle over property lines. It was a powerful reminder that when integrity meets courage, change becomes not only possible, but inevitable. For many of us, especially those in our golden years, this experience wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming our voices, our sense of purpose, and our belief that justice, though slow, always arrives. One of the most important lessons we learned was that silence enables oppression. Margaret's power didn't grow overnight. It grew in the quiet hesitations of people who feared rocking the boat. We've all been there, choosing peace over confrontation, hoping things will just work themselves out. But the truth is, bullies thrive in silence. It wasn't until we started speaking up, through whispers, then through action, that we began to dismantle the web of manipulation she'd spun around our homes. If you see something wrong, speak up, even if your voice trembles. Another takeaway that touched many of us, especially seniors, was that documentation and knowledge are powerful tools. In an age where paper trails and digital records can protect your legacy, learning how to access public records, keep personal files, and verify official documents became vital. For many of our elderly neighbors, this experience was a wake-up call, not only to protect their homes, but to protect themselves from being taken advantage of under the guise of authority. Knowledge isn't just power, it's protection. But perhaps the most beautiful realization we came to was that community isn't just about proximity, it's about people who care. We'd lived next to each other for years, but it wasn't until we stood together against a common injustice that we truly became a neighborhood. We learned the names behind the fences, shared meals, tears, and stories, and in doing so, found a new strength in our connections. It's never too late to build bridges, make friends, or rebuild trust. Lastly, for those of us who have seen years come and go, this story taught us that it's never too late to be part of something meaningful. Whether you're 40 or 80, your wisdom, experience, and voice matter. When Margaret was removed and a new board was elected, some of the most powerful ideas came from our oldest residents, people who'd lived through wars, recessions, and decades of change. They reminded us that true leadership doesn't come from titles or blazers. It comes from heart, honesty, and humility. In the end, this wasn't just about a boat, a fence, or an HOA policy. It was about remembering who we are when we stand together. A community of people who care, protect, and uplift one another. And that, no matter your age, is always worth fighting for.